The political influence and autonomy of Central Asia in this decade are expected to grow, said a former deputy assistant of US Secretary of State Evan Feigenbaum. In an interview for New Time, ex-diplomat pointed out that despite being in proximity to global powers, the countries in the region act as independent players, challenging the notion that Central Asia is a zone of someone else's interest. What role does Central Asia currently play on the political stage? What can the United States bring to the table for collaboration with the region? Please watch the fragment of the interview. Some major global players consider our region like the sphere of their interest. How do you envision the future of our region in this decade?
Well, I think the future of Central Asia ought to be one for Central Asians to determine. So the way you set that question up, that outside powers tend to think of this as the object of competition rather than a region where Central Asians themselves are the subjects of their own stories, that's very unfortunate, and it's had a very perverse set of effects on the region. I think that's changing, actually, because I think, number one, Central Asian countries are getting along better, particularly if I think about Uzbekistan after 2016 as opposed to before 2016. There are opportunities for economic integration that did not exist previously. Second, there are some natural economic complementarities, for example, in agriculture or in agriculture markets to form more of a unitary market. And third, I think Central Asian countries are making greater demands on outside powers to deliver positive sum returns, particularly to these economies, because people who live in Central Asia are making more demands on their governments. I think the challenge on the outside powers is that they tend to compete with each other, and Central Asian countries individually and collectively have to change that equation for them. If I can use a mathematical metaphor, the name of the game here should be addition and multiplication, whereas outside powers are usually thinking about subtraction and division, how to dominate another power, how to remove another power from the region. And what that's going to require is that collectively and individually you demand more from outside players. So I think the challenge is to demand more of these partners, and when you don't get it, to leverage the partners in order to get more. And so that, as I said, requires some joint efforts, and I'm seeing more of that in Central Asia today than I ever have in the period of my involvement with the region. 10 years ago, it was almost inconceivable.
It's good to hear. My last question is, you were the author of a report proposing 7 key principles for US policy in Central Asia. The world has changed rapidly since that time. Now, over 10 years later, how have these principles evolved? And what would you add to these principles today?
Yeah, I mean, the world has changed. I think the 2 principles, as I remember, it's a very old article, but if I remember 2 of the principles that I think still have force and salience, one is the one that we just talked about, which is I said the United States needs to put Central Asians at the center of the policy. And I still think that's true. Infrastructure, particularly infrastructure that develops economies, is not just hard. Hard means a road that you pave or a bridge that you build. That's fine, but if there's nothing to trade across the bridge, then the bridge just sits there empty. Soft infrastructure, border procedures, customs, education, connections across the capital markets, investment, this is just as important, and in many cases even more important, because at the end of the day, it's really what creates economic value. So I think if I look back and then I look forward, I still think that's the basic principle the United States ought to adhere to. But I think, unfortunately, particularly since it withdrew from Afghanistan, the United States is taking less interest in this part of the world, still thinks too much in terms of security, still thinks too much in terms of trying to outcompete others on terms that don't redound to the benefit of the United States. And so when I'm in Washington and I'm asked for advice on this, I say something very similar to what I just said to you. And I can think of a lot of things that American educational institutions, financial services firms, or a culture of venture capital might help to do in this country and elsewhere in the region, and I'd like to see more of that.